They hanged her from a cottonwood for being half-blood, and left her for the sun and the crows. But the rancher came, and he cut the rope, and he called her his. This was the edge of the New Mexico territory, in the late spring of 1873. A stretch of land where the desert began to bleed into the hills, and the wind moved without pause, carrying dust and silence in equal measure. The sun hung high and unrelenting, pouring its heat down over cracked earth and thorn brush. Randy Rayner rode slow, his gaze scanning the dry trail for any sign of the sorrel mare that had bolted in the night. He'd been tracking hoofprints since dawn, faint impressions half lost in the brittle soil, leading him toward a sparse stand of trees. The air shimmered, hot enough to blister the paint from a saddle. Tugging his hat lower against the glare, Randy dismounted. He led his horse by the reins, stepping lightly, his eyes sweeping the terrain with the practiced calm of a man who had spent more years alone than not. That was when he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been the wind sighing through dry grass. But it came again. A soft, wet gasp, like someone trying to remember how to breathe. He froze. Randy dropped the reins, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his back. He moved toward the sound with slow, measured steps. Between the trees, the shadows deepened. The birds had gone quiet. The air felt strange, heavier. Then he saw her. She hung by her wrists from the thick branch of an old tree, her arms stretched taut above her head. Her body was limp, swaying slightly in the breeze. Nailed to the trunk above her, a crude wooden sign. Half-blood don't belong. The air went thin in Randy's lungs. He took a half-step back, as if the words themselves could strike him. The message wasn't for her. It was a warning for anyone who might pass by. The girl's skin was sun-darkened and streaked with grime. Long black hair clung to her face in damp ropes. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn and smeared with dust and dried blood. Her legs hung uselessly, her bare feet just brushing the dirt. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, stuttering movements. She was alive. Barely. Randy lowered his rifle. Christ, he muttered, the word both a prayer and a curse. Stepping forward, he could see the angry, raw burns where the rope had bitten into her wrists. Her lips were split, her cheeks hollowed by thirst. One eye was swollen completely shut. "You hear me, girl?" Randy asked, his voice rough but low. There was no answer. Her head hung like a broken stem. "I ain't here to hurt you." Still no movement. But a sound escaped her. A whimper so faint it was barely there. It was enough. Randy reached for his belt and drew his knife. His fingers hovered at the rope, hesitating for the briefest second. The sign still loomed, its message jagged like a wound. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Not today." With one clean stroke, the knife sliced through the rope. The girl fell forward. Randy caught her just in time, her body collapsing into his arms, light as smoke and burning with fever. Her head lolled against his chest. For a moment her eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused, her lips moving without sound. Then her fingers clutched weakly at his shirt, and her body went still. Randy crouched, cradling her with one arm while reaching for his canteen with the other. He poured a few drops onto a scrap of cloth and gently dabbed at her mouth. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe. For the moment, at least." The wind stirred the branches overhead. The sign creaked. He looked up at it one last time, then down at her. and without another word, he stood, lifting her into his arms. She didn't weigh more than a sack of oats. "You got a name?" he asked, already knowing she wouldn't answer. Silence. "Guess we'll find one." He turned away from the tree, from the sign, from whatever curse they had tried to hang her with. His boots crunched softly over the dry leaves as he walked back toward his horse. Behind him, the sign still swung in the wind, but the girl was no longer beneath it. Later that evening, the sun dipped low as Randy Rayner rode into the hollow where his ranch was tucked. A modest cabin and a barn nestled in a dry ravine, miles from any town. The land stretched empty in every direction, broken only by sagebrush and rock. Naomi lay sideways in the saddle, unconscious but breathing. Randy dismounted and gently lifted her down, cradling her as if she were made of glass. The cabin door creaked open under his boot. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of cedar and dust. He laid her carefully on the single cot near the window, then covered her with a clean wool blanket. She stirred, her brow twitching. "Easy," Randy whispered again. He lit the oil lamp, its glow flickering against the rough wooden walls. He fetched a basin, poured in water from a jug, and warmed it over the stove. Crouching beside her, he saw her face, bruised and dry, streaked with sweat and blood. Without speaking, Randy dipped a cloth into the warm water and began to clean her skin. His movements were gentle, slow, done with the care of someone used to mending broken things, afraid this one might fall apart if he wasn't careful. He cleaned her wrists last. The raw grooves from the rope were deep and angry. He paused, his hand hovering above her arm. Then, steady as breath, he wrapped the wounds in clean linen, tying each knot loose but firm. Hours passed. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters, but inside the cabin, it was still. Naomi hadn't spoken, not even in her sleep. Randy sat on the floor by the door, watching the shadows shift. Sometime after midnight, she stirred again. Her eyes flew open, dark and filled with panic. She jerked upright, gasping, her hand clawing at the blanket as if trying to stem her way out. Hey now," Randy said, standing quickly but keeping his distance. "You're all right. You're safe here." Naomi's gaze darted around the cabin, her breathing sharp and uneven. When her eyes landed on him, she flinched back. Randy didn't move closer. "I ain't them," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." She said nothing, just stared, her eyes wild. "You don't have to talk," he added. "Don't even have to stay. But I cut you down for a reason, and it wasn't to see you die slow in my house." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Randy walked to a shelf, took down a cup, and poured water from the jug. He set it on the small table by her bed, then stepped back. Naomi watched his every movement like a hunted animal. He sat in the corner again, giving her space. Silence fell between them. The wind howled outside, but the cabin held. Eventually, her hands trembling, Naomi reached for the cup and drank. Randy saw it then, the subtle shift, the way her shoulders eased just slightly, the way her eyes no longer looked through him, but at him. Still guarded, still silent, but no longer empty. She lay back down slowly, cradling the cup. Randy didn't speak again that night. He just watched her drift into a restless sleep, the water half finished in her lap, the linen on her wrists stained faintly red. In the dark, he whispered mostly to himself, You're safe here. That's all you need to know. And in the silence that followed, she didn't speak, but she didn't run. The wind blew dry and sharp across the Rayner ranch, stirring the sand into restless curls that skittered over the hard-packed earth. It had been over a week since Randy brought Naomi back, and the silence between them had grown more settled. Like a pact, neither had spoken aloud. But something else had begun to shift in the air, an unease that he could not quite place. Randy noticed it first in the morning light. A set of footprints, too narrow and too fresh to be his own. They curved along the edge of the barn, then disappeared behind the well. Someone had been watching. He kept the discovery to himself, but from that day on he started sleeping with his rifle laid across his lap. He checked the lock every evening and scanned the horizon for any sign of movement before letting the horses out to graze. Naomi had not yet stepped outside. She stayed mostly by the window, wrapped in Randy's old coat, watching the world with guarded eyes. But that changed one evening, just as the last rays of sun stained the ground blood red. Without a word, she pushed the door open and stepped barefoot into the yard. Randy looked up sharply from where he sat, whittling a piece of driftwood. He said nothing, only watched as she walked slowly across the dust, her feet light and cautious. In her hand was a long, slender stick. She knelt in the open space near the barn and began to draw in the dirt. Randy rose, approaching carefully. Naomi didn't flinch when he stopped a few feet behind her. Her focus remained on the earth as the lines took shape. Arching curves, pointed wings, a body erupting into flame. It was a bird, mid-flight, wrapped in fire. "What's that?" Randy asked softly. She didn't look up. "It's my family's sign," she said, her voice raspy but sure. "Firebird." Randy crouched beside her, studying the lines. "My mother used to paint it on our tent poles," she continued. "We believed the firebird was a spirit of protection, fierce but never cruel. It flew through flames so others could survive." Her voice caught. "I was supposed to die with them." She spoke slowly, as if her throat burned with each word. "They said we killed a white rancher's wife. We didn't. It was her husband. He beat her. Everyone knew, but we were different. So they blamed us." Naomi's fingers clenched the stick. "The soldiers came first. Then the townsfolk. With fire. With ropes. I ran. I saw my brothers shot down outside our tent. My mother. She screamed until the flames took her." She dropped the stick. "I was just a girl. They tied me up like some warning. I thought I would die under that tree." Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't cry. Her eyes stared into the dirt, at the flame she had drawn. Randy didn't speak. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he slowly lowered himself until his palm pressed flat into the ground, right beside the image of the firebird. Naomi looked over at him, her eyes wet now but steady. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was something deeper. A vow. No words needed. No promises made. Just the weight of his hand in the earth beside her grief. A silent anchor that said, "I see it. I see you. And I won't look away." And for the first time since Randy had cut her from that tree, Naomi let her tears fall. Not out of fear, but because someone had finally stayed. The air was unnaturally still when the soldiers came. Randy saw the dust first, a thick plume rising on the far ridge, cutting across the sky like smoke from a distant fire. He stood at the fence line, his jaw tightening. The glint of brass and the rhythm of hooves confirmed it. U.S. cavalry. Naomi stood just inside the cabin door, hidden in shadow, watching him watch them. 3 men rode up, but only one dismounted. He was tall and sharp-featured, with boots too polished for the land he stood on. A silver badge gleamed on his chest. Lieutenant Garrett James. His voice cut clean through the dry air. Randy Rayner? Randy nodded slowly. That's me. The lieutenant reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and handed it over. You're a law-abiding man, I take it. Seen this girl around? Randy unfolded the wanted notice. The sketch was rough, but unmistakable. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a fire in her eyes, even on paper. Her name was printed below, Naomi. Wanted for murder and escape. Reward, $75. She's considered dangerous, Garrett continued. Killed a settler's wife. Stabbed 2 soldiers on her way out of custody. You'd be doing the country a service if you turned her in. Randy stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he refolded it carefully and handed it back. Ain't seen no girl around here, he said flatly. Garrett cocked his head. You sure about that? You live out here alone? Always have. The lieutenant looked past him, toward the cabin. Mind if we take a look around? I do. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Got something to hide? Randy's voice dropped lower. Only my peace, and I'd like to keep it. For a moment, the 2 men held each other's gaze like drawn pistols. Then Garrett gave a tight smile and climbed back onto his horse. Well, if you do see anything unusual, Rayner, we'll be nearby. And with that, they rode off, leaving only silence and suspicion behind. Randy watched until the dust swallowed them completely. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the house. Naomi was sitting at the table, stiff as stone. She had heard everything. When he stepped inside, she looked at him with those wide, dark eyes, half afraid, half something else. Then, quietly, she asked, Why did you lie for me? Randy set his hat on its peg, then looked at her for a long time. When the words came, they came slow. Because when I look at you, I don't see a killer. Her lip trembled. She looked away, as if the weight of being believed was heavier than the rope that had once held her. That night, after the sky had turned to coal, they sat side by the fire. Naomi had wrapped herself in a woven blanket, her knees drawn to her chest. Randy sat nearby, sharpening his knife, the sound of stone against steel steady and calm. After a long silence, Naomi shifted. She turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and slowly reached out. First, she placed her hand on her own chest, right over her heart. Then she leaned forward and pressed that same hand to his chest, above the place where his heart beat solid and slow beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. Randy froze. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The meaning pulsed between them, quiet and fierce. I am still here, and so are you. His hand rose, not to stop her, not to question, but to cover hers, his fingers lacing with her own. In the crackling glow of the fire, something shifted. Not a confession, not a vow, just an understanding. And for the first time, neither of them felt alone. The sun was sinking low, casting long golden slashes across the dry earth when the riders came. Randy heard them before he saw them, hooves pounding the dirt, voices sharp with the kind of anger that travels in packs. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle slung casually across his back. the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. 5 men rode into the clearing. At the front was Joe Cormack. Joe had always been a bad man wearing a good man's badge, back when he wore one. Now he was just leather and guns, with a mean grin that stretched too far across his face. "Well, hell," Joe called, swinging down from his horse. "You always had a way with strays, Randy. But this one's trouble." Behind him, the other men dismounted, rifles in hand, their faces taut with sweat and hate. Randy didn't flinch. He just watched. Joe sauntered up to the porch, spitting into the dust. "Word is, you're hiding her. Half-blood girl. Killed a man with his own knife. That true?" Randy didn't answer. Joe gestured toward the cabin. "We're gonna take a look. That all right with you?" "No." The single word cracked the air. Joe blinked. "No?" Randy's voice was low, steady. "This is my land. You're not welcome." Joe chuckled, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. "Randy, don't be a damn fool. We'll torch this whole place if we have to. We're not leaving without her." Randy stepped down from the porch, slow and deliberate. The rifle stayed on his back. "She's not yours to hang," he said. "She's mine to protect." Joe's smile vanished. "You gonna stop 5 men with that mouth of yours?" "No," Randy said. "But I'll start with you." The air turned razor sharp. For a beat, no one moved. Then Joe lunged. Randy ducked the punch, turned, and slammed his shoulder into Joe's chest, knocking him backward. One of the others raised his rifle. But before he could aim, Randy's hand was already on his, twisting hard until the weapon dropped. He didn't fire. He didn't draw. He moved like water flowing over stone, fast, relentless, using their weight against them. He dodged, ducked, disarmed. One man tripped over his own boots. Another yelped as Randy cracked a forearm across his nose. Dust kicked up in clouds. Hooves skittered as the horses backed away. The 5th man, the youngest of them, froze mid-motion, his eyes wide. "Go," Randy growled. And just like that, it ended. The men scrambled, cursing, dragging Joe to his feet. Randy stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, shirt torn, his knuckles bleeding. But his eyes burned with something too fierce for fear. Joe spit blood. "This ain't over." "It is," Randy said. "For you." The men mounted up and galloped off, the sound of their retreat echoing against the canyon walls. Naomi had watched everything from the doorway. She hadn't moved. She hadn't breathed. As the dust settled and a profound silence reclaimed the land, she descended from the porch. Barefoot in the fading light, her eyes were locked on him. He turned to her, bloodied and bruised, but still on his feet. And then, for the first time since he had cut her from that tree, she spoke his name. Randy. It was a single word, yet it held the weight of worlds. Gratitude and wonder, terror and hope. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and gave one slow nod. "Yeah," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm here." She moved toward him, her first step small and hesitant, then quickening into a run. When she reached him, there were no tears. She simply pressed her forehead to his chest, right over the hard, steady drum of his heart. He raised his arms, uncertain, then let them fall around her. Not to trap, not to claim, just to hold. In the dying light, surrounded by blood and dust and the ghost of ropes. They stood that way for a long, long time. That night, the wind softened, whispering low through the sagebrush, as if the desert itself had grown weary. One by one, stars blinked into existence, scattered like salt across the endless dark canvas above Randy Reiner's ranch. Inside the cabin, a lantern cast a soft golden glow, its flicker stretching shadows long and gentle against the wooden walls. Randy sat by the hearth, the slow, rhythmic rasp of a whetstone on steel the only sound. The blade was already sharp. His hands moved from habit, not necessity. Across the room, the woman stood by the window, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts. Her dark hair, braided loosely down her back, was a slash of ink against the faded plaid. She had been quiet all day, but her stillness now held a different kind of weight, something heavier than fatigue. He glanced over. "You sleeping on your feet now?" She didn't answer at first. Then she turned, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor as she crossed the room. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice low and even. Randy set the knife aside and looked up as she sat across from him. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes steady but unreadable. "My name's not Naomi," she began. "It never was." Randy didn't blink. He simply waited. She took a breath. "My real name is Cian. It means bringer of life. My mother gave it to me on the night of a blood moon. She said it was a sign that I would carry fire and healing in equal measure." Cian. He spoke the name as if tasting it, and the very air in the cabin seemed to shift. "I was 6 when she taught me to paint firebirds on bark," she continued, her voice growing distant. "She said they flew between worlds, messengers, watchers, survivors. The night they came, the soldiers, the men from town. She painted one on the door of our tent." Her hands began to tremble. "They dragged us out. I remember the look in her eyes as they set the tents ablaze. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at them, as if memorizing the face of every man who held a torch." Randy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening as if her voice were the most fragile thing in the world. "She pushed me into a hollow beneath the roots of a fallen cedar," Cian said. "She told me to be quiet. She told me that if I lived, I would have to carry something. Not hate, not revenge, but the truth." Her eyes finally met his, a challenge burning in their depths. "You want the truth, Randy? Here it is." Her voice cracked, just once. "If I wasn't half white, if I didn't have your blood in me too, would you have still cut me down from that tree?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the small space between them and laid his hand against her cheek. The calluses on his fingers were like worn leather, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "I don't love your blood," he said quietly. "I love the fight inside it." Cian's lips parted, a sharp breath catching in her throat. Her eyes searched his, and something ancient within her, a wall of ice that had braced for betrayal every day since the fire, began to thaw. Slowly, she leaned in. Their foreheads touched first, then their lips. The kiss wasn't one of hunger or desperation. It was a release, a letting go of fear, of silence, of the crushing weight they had both carried for too long. It lasted only a moment, but it said everything they had no words for. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. He kept his hand on her cheek, his thumb brushing just below her eye. "You believe me?" she whispered. "I believed you the moment you drew that bird in the dirt," Randy murmured. Outside, the night deepened. The fire crackled low. The desert wind shifted, as if the land itself had taken a breath and let it go. And inside the cabin, two souls sat close enough to hear each other breathe. No longer strangers, no longer fugitives, but two broken halves that had finally begun to mend. The sun had barely slipped below the horizon when the riders appeared on the ridge. Dust curled behind their horses like smoke rising from the earth. From the fence post, Randy watched through a spyglass, one hand tight around the brass, the other resting near the butt of his revolver. Even at this distance, he could see the glint of blue uniforms and polished metal. U.S. Cavalry. "They're coming," he muttered. Inside, Cian stood at the window, arms wrapped around her waist. She didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the hills, as if she could slow the inevitable just by watching. A soft knock sounded on the open door. Randy stepped in, removing his hat. His face was drawn, etched with the weight of a choice already made. "Saw the flag," he said simply. "They're about a day out. Maybe less, if they ride hard." Cian nodded once, slowly. "You knew they would come." "I did." "And you stayed." He stepped closer, placing his hat on the table. His eyes met hers, direct and unwavering. "I stayed because us, it's worth more than the dirt they want to bury you in." She looked down, her fingers twisting the fabric of her blouse. "They won't stop, Randy." "I know," he said, "which is why we can't stay." Cian's eyes lifted. "Run?" He shook his head. "Not run. Just ride somewhere else. Somewhere their laws don't reach. South, over the border. There's land where no one knows your name. Where they won't look at your skin and call it a crime." He moved closer still, his voice low and steady. "Cian, I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to live. With me." Her breath hitched. "I'm not afraid of them," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "Not anymore." "I know," he replied softly. "I'll go," she said. "But not to escape. I'll go to live. With you." A quiet, final silence settled between them, soft and full. And then she smiled. It was a small thing, tinged with sadness, but it was real. That night, as the dry wind swept over the ridges, they prepared. Randy packed light, jerky, a canteen, a single blanket rolled tight. He saddled the horses with a practiced economy of motion, murmuring to them as his sum. Inci low tones. Cian dressed in simple brown cloth, her hair braided tight for the journey. Around her neck, she tied a single red thread, a piece of her mother's shawl she had kept all these years. They left before the moon rose. The cabin door swung shut behind them, unlatched. No fire was left burning. The only trail they left was the print of hooves in the dust. The night was vast and quiet, the stars like old gods watching from above. Two riders moving through the dark. Not fugitives, not heroes. Just a man and a woman with nothing left but each other, and nowhere left to go but forward. As they crossed the dry creek bed at the edge of the valley, Cian glanced back one last time. "What is it?" Randy asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll remember the way the wind sounded here." He nodded. "I'll remember the first time you said my name." They rode on, silent again. Trust was no longer a question between them. It was the only thing they carried. The moon was high now, full and pale as bone, casting the scrubland in a ghostly silver light. A few more miles and they would be across the border, unseen, forgotten, free. Randy's breath was a low, steady rhythm as his eyes swept the trail ahead. Beside him, Cian's fingers were tight on the reins, the red thread at her neck a tiny, fluttering flag of defiance. Then the shot. A merciless crack that tore through the silence. Randy jerked in the saddle as a crimson star bloomed across his shirt. "Randy!" Cian's scream was ripped from her as he slumped sideways, hitting the ground with a heavy groan, one hand clutching his side. Another shot whizzed past her head. In an instant, she was off her horse, dragging him toward a narrow crevice in the rocks, an old wash carved by forgotten rains. She gritted her teeth, the rocks scraping her knees as she hauled his dead weight out of the line of fire. Blood was already soaking through his fingers. He looked up at her, his eyes glassy with pain. "They tied you to a tree once," he rasped, "because of men like them. I won't let you be left behind. Not again." Cian pressed both hands to his wound, her touch firm, desperate. Her voice was steel. "Then don't die. We live together, or we fight together." She pulled his rifle from its scabbard, checked the chamber, and peered through a gap in the rocks. Two cavalrymen were dismounting, moving slowly, confidently, through the brush. She set her jaw. She waited until one stepped clear into the moonlight, and then she fired. The man screamed and dropped, clutching his leg. The other dove for cover. She fired again, this time wide, making him think they were not alone. They didn't come closer. An eternity of minutes passed before the sound of fading hoofbeats finally dissolved into the night. She turned back to Randy. He was barely conscious. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead. "We're almost there." And somehow, they made it. By dawn, they were across the border. By nightfall, they found a clearing near a river bend, deep in the pines where no patrols rode and no maps reached. Weeks turned into a season. The wound healed slowly, leaving Randy with a limp, but he was alive. He began to train horses again, his eyes never straying from Cian for long. In a small house they built of pine and patience, Cian sat by a window, stitching a tiny shirt no bigger than her forearm. Her belly had grown round beneath her apron. Her hands moved with a slow, steady grace. Outside, Randy's calm voice gentled a young Mustang around the corral, but his gaze always found its way back to her silhouette in the window. The past hadn't vanished, but here, in this quiet place, it no longer hunted them. Cian folded the little shirt, held it to her chest, and smiled. "Bought over." They tried to hang her for being half of something, but he loved her for being whole. Not for what she looked like, but for what she refused to become. Broken. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that even in a world of dust, fire, and judgment, love can still carve out a place of safety, then this is your kind of frontier. Here at Wild West Love Stories, we bring you tales where quiet hearts fight loud battles, where defiance and tenderness ride side by side. So don't ride off just yet. Hit that like button. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and join a circle of folks who still believe in loyalty, second chances, and a love that refuses to quit. Every week, a new story from the edge of the world, crafted just for you. We'll be waiting for you under the stars.